Thanks very much for attending this session on reimagining assessment design in the era of AI, the challenges, opportunities, strategies and resources. I'm Dr. Cherie Lucas. I am a Nexus Fellow for the Faculty of Medicine and Health, and very honoured to be here to present this. Just want to, as a disclaimer, I do not know all the answers. I don't even know half the answers. This will be more of a collective discussion, and hopefully we learn from each other. Acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge the Bedigal people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So I just wanted to put it out there that reimagining assessment design, why it matters now. And everyone in this room and online will know that ChatGPT launched in November 2022. And by March 2024, TEXA asked us as education providers to provide a response for AI use and mitigation of that by June 2024. And then in November last year, TEXA provided some guidance with a toolkit, a practice toolkit. So the notifications here, so just some of the documents that you may be interested in. In November 2023, the assessment reform document. Oops, what's going on here? The information for requests in terms of AI risk mitigation, and also Gen AI strategies for higher education, which was the toolkit and emerging practice. All right, so by the end of this workshop, participants will be able to will be able to identify some of the challenges we have with assessment design in the era of AI, consider some of the principles of good course design and good assessment design, develop strategies or some assessment strategies for mitigating that risk, but also looking at leveraging AI for learning, and reflect on ethical considerations. So I am going to talk about the disruption that we've had over the last couple of years and the opportunities we actually have as educators. Some of the strategies around redesign, some of the considerations, the support that we have at UNSW and the ongoing support and guidance, and also the way forward with some considerations. Okay, with the disruption or the challenges we have, and this is not a new one, assessments drive student learning. And we need to consider that assessments are important because it does drive that learning. Gen AI agents, they're constantly evolving, and as those models have been trained, they're actually getting much better. So we need to really think about Gen AI in that process. As educators, we cannot rely on the Turnitin AI detectors, as we know now that Grammarly and other AI tools can give false positive scores in the Turnitin AI detectors. So that's not going to be great to rely on that. But as educators, we need to ensure that our graduates have the skills, knowledge and competencies that we say they have at the end of the program or degree. So how do we do that? Now, there is a shift from those traditional assessments, so that those final products, those artefacts, those essays, those reports. And there is now a need to place more focus on the processes and hopefully higher order thinking processes over the final product. So how do we do that? What's the balance related to that? Now, do we weight those processes higher than the product? And this is where we can have the rubric and weighting some of those processes higher than the final product. But when we're rethinking assessment design, we also need to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And having that to be fit for purpose has its own challenges for educators. Our workload, the scalability, the effectiveness, and the resources. Okay, just a quick question. What are your main concerns when reimagining assessment design online? Just if you can put it in the chat, that would be great. And Laura, if you can kind of pipe up as some people are actually putting things in the chat, that would be great. What are your main concerns? As educators, what are your main concerns? We have none?
Doesn't look like there's any concerns. Oh, workload is one of them.
Workload, yeah. Okay.
Marks and allocation, scalability.
Yes. Anything else?
Robustness of assessment remains the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Fairness, authenticity. There's some good ones in here, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, we've got a number of concerns here when we're thinking about redesigning our assessment. Now, I wanted to go back to sort of the first principles in terms of course design, because before we can even start with the assessment, we've got to think of the course design itself and then how that relates to your assessment. So I've included this slide because it has a few resources on it. And going back to those principles, like a constructive alignment, making sure the course design is aligned to the learning outcomes. Student-centered learning, the transparency and clarity of the assessment and its structure and the and instructions as well. Authentic and applied learning. We want to prepare our students for real-world contexts, so authentic learning is essential. Inclusivity and accessibility, so universal design for learning, ensuring there's equitable access and learning opportunities for all students. Active and collaborative learning, a skill that needs to be used throughout life and lifelong learning. Formative and summative assessment balance, making sure you have that balance. So, for example, is it assessment for learning? Is it assessment of learning? Or is it assessment as learning? So for learning is primarily formative. As learning is more of an evaluation of the student, so it's primarily summative. And as learning is when a student takes kind of agency in their learning, and the assessment is a tool for their further feedback and reflection. The use of technology and digital tools, of course, and scaffolding and progression. So is the student building on previous work? And this is going to be important in a programmatic approach. And of course, reflection and continuous improvement, where in the course or program are there areas for the student to reflect on, get the feedback, and continuously improve. There are 5 principles for assessment for learning that we have here at UNSW, and this is just a recap. Everyone's got this on the website. Assessment guides and enhances student learning. Learning is assessed against clear outcomes and performance standards. Assessment provides credible information on achievement. An assessment is fair and provides equitable opportunities across the board. And also assessment fosters self and peer evaluation skills. I also wanted to show this particular slide because you may not be aware of some of the resources that we do have here at UNSW, and these are also some key principles of AI usage in assessment. This is the one of the key principles is that transparency of when an AI agent is used, and that should be disclosed, and also that any AI-based output is reviewed, critiqued with all the due diligence before it's relied upon. Now, as educators, we should be modelling this as well. We should be modelling when we use Gen AI. I use Gen AI for rubric design, and I model that to the students. And I actually say at the end of my rubric in the first lecture that this is the rubric that's going to be assessing your work. This rubric was designed with the assistance of and whatever agent I use, Copilot, ChatGPT, whatever it might have been. And it was generated by prompts by myself, for example, and peer reviewed. It was peer reviewed by a couple of my colleagues, and I'll mention their names. If I use an image, similarly, I would actually acknowledge that image. So the image was designed by whatever agent and prompts authored by Dr. Cherie Lucas, and I would mention that as well. So while we're modelling this, we're obviously modelling this for our students, so when they use Gen AI. Okay, so I know Gen AI is here, and it's here to stay and here to evolve, but we do have some opportunities now to really think about our assessments in a more, making sure that we design those assessments where they are authentic, they are fit for purpose, that they are maybe more nuanced or complex, that will demonstrate higher order thinking processes, and maybe have some creativity within that assessment task, which will work towards being AI resilient, although nothing is totally AI resilient. And it also makes you think at this point, why are we assessing? And how are we assessing? And whether every assessment task is necessary to be assessed, for example. And the stakes of those assessment tasks, really thinking about the stakes, how high are those stakes? And when you are thinking about assessment, you're thinking also about the rubric design. How can we adjust our rubric to enhance the high order thinking processes and enhance higher weighting to the processes of thinking towards getting that final product? Oops. Now, when I think of high order thinking processes, I actually go back to the taxonomies. Bloom's initially was, the original Bloom's taxonomy is the 1956 version, where the highest level of cognitive verbs were sitting in the evaluation stage. This is a revised taxonomy, 2001, and you can see from remembering, understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating and creating. As you go up the taxonomy, you're getting higher order thinking processes. I work with my colleagues and we do design rubrics with AI, and we include a Bloom's revised taxonomy cognitive verbs or other taxonomy cognitive verbs, and it's just tailored to the learning context. So this is just another way of looking at it, and I just like the pyramid. So from remember all the way to create. And as you go up that pyramid, you are working towards AI resilience. However, nothing, unless you're talking face-to-face in real time and Q&A, nothing is resilient to that extent. Oregon State University has this fantastic infographic, and it looks at Bloom's taxonomy revisited. So it looks at the levels, it looks at the AI capabilities, and also the distinctive human skills. So I thought I'd include this as a resource because you may want to look at how AI is capable at each of those levels. The other taxonomy that is quite interesting, in the course, in the CDI last year, I was introduced to Fink's taxonomy of significant learning outcomes. It's a more recent taxonomy of cognitive verbs. This might be applicable often in the health professions. So these have got the human dimension, those caring elements. You may want to be assessing a student, say, for example, on empathy, and you may want to include these type of verbs within your rubric. A bit of a plug from the other day. So my Nexus colleagues and I actually conducted a workshop in the room here a couple of days ago. They've got an MP4 of that recording. It actually goes through some of the best practice prompts, designing rubrics and actually adding those revised taxonomies or Fink's taxonomy and how you would do that in your rubrics. So I've just thought I'd leave the link there. It's very hard to include a lot of information in this 1 hour session. Now, you may have seen this paper. It was published on the 15th of May by Deakin University and Sydney University researchers, Corbin, Dawson and Danny Liu. And I found it really interesting paper. It actually talks about the differences between discursive changes versus the structural assessment changes. And they talk about discursive changes which heavily rely on all those instructions you give students related to Gen AI and whether the students comply to that or not, and those instructions could be ignored. The task mechanics are primarily unchanged, so it really doesn't secure the assessment if you're only relying on discursive changes. They're suggesting that structural changes is that where to go in future, and because they don't really rely on any interpretation of instructions, and it makes some modifications to the mechanics of the assessment. For example, it constrains perhaps how a student can interact with Gen AI. And this could be something like, in some areas, there's supervision in some tasks or in-person tasks, or some progressive scaffolding or oral defences, for example. This is straight from the paper. It just gives some differences between discursive and structural changes. As an example, a traditional take-home essay telling the students to use AI for editing but not for generating text is the discursive change. The structural change is supervising the generation of parts of that essay. Another vulnerable assessment task, online multiple choice quiz, where there's a warning sign at the front page of the online quiz telling the students that they cannot use Gen AI or AI, and the structural change would be discussing at random questions with the student in interactive oral assessments. And the last one, the lab report. So raising the importance of not fabricating any data with AI and having those checkpoints in live discussion sessions and a tutor to sign off. But that also relies on the tutor's time and the people who are supervising, and it may not be hugely helpful in very large cohorts. However, the areas where structural change does secure the assessment is certainly something to think about. Okay, so designing for authentic assessments. So that's really where we're at the moment. I mean, we want to design assessments to reflect real world challenges, skills, and contexts that are related to the discipline and the various professions, which either simulate or replicate how knowledge is applied in practice. So we are moving towards or from traditional assessment types, which is maybe some knowledge types, essays, reports, multiple choice questions, to looking at authentic assessment. So the area in the middle there, in terms of the viva voces, the performances, the practical demonstrations and the discussions, are where we're looking towards perfecting. So in terms of the redesign, I mean, this is my interpretation of a table, so it may not be everything's interpretation in terms of where it would sit in the table, but simulated real world tasks, role plays, simulation. We use, well, someone is actually piloting SimConverse in medicine and health, and also my dispense in some of the other universities, and another AI tool where simulation and engagement with the student. OSCEs, objective structured clinical examinations, primarily in pharmacy and other health professions where the students go from one station to another, and they're usually supervised, and other supervised real world tasks, work integrated learning, for example, on placements and internships where you have a preceptor or supervisor that will oversee a student's work. And then there's those process-driven assessments, like you're observing someone's skills or performance, or maybe there's a development of a documentary over certain timeframes, a creation of videos, for example, or video diaries, practical demonstrations, and producing podcasts. And then there's the interactive oral defences and engagement, debates, panels, face-to-face presentations, asking them to pitch something, and this Q&A afterwards. I've highlighted the producing the podcast in red because obviously AI is quite good at mimicking voices, and also with deepfakes, you know, video diaries and those sorts of things as well. AI is quite good, but what this does show, it is working towards some AI resilience and also working towards authentic assessment. Now, does everything need to be assessed across a course or program? So this is something we really need to consider now, because we have the opportunity to consider this now. Do we really need the 3 or 4 tasks in a 10-week course? Do we, you know, or is it best to think about across a program? Well, consider a programmatic approach. So my colleague Mark-Ian Jones has done some wonderful work in the AI and creative context space with mapping a programmatic approach and what that means. And Deanna Turnip and team from Faculty of Medicine and Health has done some work in relation to what a programmatic assessment looks like. So in terms of a programmatic approach, think about some of the learning outcomes. There is a series of data points throughout the program where the assessment is more secure. It's invigilated, it's supervised. And some courses may have lower levels of security for an assessment task at the beginning of a program, especially if something similar is going to come up later at the program or be repeated to make sure that the learning has been reached at that stage. Now, integration of low stakes to high stakes assessment is something to consider with increasing complexity across a program and having that continuous feedback. And also making sure it is a whole program approach. Are we mapping it to the program learning outcomes? Because at the end of the day, we as educators have to ensure that we have graduates with the skills and knowledge and competencies that we say they do have. So scaffolding that learning. So it gives the student the opportunity to kind of, well, it gives us the opportunity to capture the student's learning and development at different checkpoints, and there could be multiple checkpoints across the program, and it makes the scaffolding will build on their previous work. Okay, the support. Now it's interesting. I wanted to bring your attention to this fantastic checklist that we have here at UNSW. It's on our website. It looks at the redesign and backwards design. It considers flipped models, flipped assessments when students solve problems with AI and how they assess the outcome. It talks about authentic assessment and also gives some advice on written assignments and oral assessments. And if you haven't seen this this particular resource, it's actually quite a valuable resource, and I'll suggest you have a look at that. So, as an FYI, I'm on the OpenAI Enterprise and Educator trial, ChatGPT Educator trial. And so I've had the honour to dabble with all the features there. It's been great. And we're learning from all the different communities of practice and all my colleagues on that trial. So I do dabble with Copilot and ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, and they're the main ones I look at. And obviously I've seen what Cogniti does as well at Sydney University. But I've worked across 3 universities over the last 25 years, 16 years at Sydney University, 8 years at UTS, and I've come here about 18 months ago. And one of my first tasks was to develop a course convener AI toolkit, which is currently a living document at UNSW. And I was working alongside with my colleague, Anita Haywood, and I'd just like to mention that we both published something like this on our website, on our SharePoint site. Obviously, the background for developing the toolkit, AI, fast-changing, evolving landscape. The response to emergence of Gen AI really does require a multifaceted approach. Obviously, the response to TEXA was a consideration, and then also considerations of responsible and ethical use of AI. And it's interesting, even though I've been teaching for 25 years and some of the projects I've been undertaking, that usually starts with a strategy from the leadership level and then works its way down. But this Gen AI, we've really come from the ground up approach and looking at the emerging cases. So the purpose of the toolkit was really reviewing the assessments we have with some AI vulnerability, and unfortunately the vulnerability was quite high unless they were OSCEs or other supervised tasks. And we looked at all the assessments across all the schools in the Faculty of Medicine Health. So there's a number of schools in that. We looked at thinking about some of the strategies for redesign with obviously the provision of guidelines and some of the strategies from exemplar cases. And then directing the course conveners to the newly developed resources and policy documents, which kept on updating and changing since I started this task in March last year. And then we were also thinking about how AI could be used for educators and the ethical use for educators to help with the student learning and the balance of building capability and resources for educators and also for students. So there wasn't any precedence before March 2024. I did look at the scientific literature and it wasn't really great in lots of different aspects. It was quite minimal at that time, but post March 2024, it started to come through. I did look at the institutional documents worldwide, and there was limited policy documents at that stage. And the other grey literature was, I did tap into the academic authors on their commentaries and opinion articles in the scholarly blogs. And then there were some emerging case studies in Faculty of Medicine and Health. Then I had lots of chats with the directors of teaching, the deputy directors of teaching, my Nexus fellows and Nexus educational designers. And then I took it all to a roundtable facilitated discussion at the last education focused annual retreat, and obviously harnessed some of their views and ideas and strategies. So we were really learning from each other. So this is the course convener toolkit, and we do have a link on the SharePoint site for those who are in UNSW. You can have a look at that. But I just wanted to do a snapshot of a few things that are in the toolkit that may be interesting to some of you, because it is applicable. Most of the things here are applicable across other faculties and schools. Okay, so obviously we looked at all the assessment types, looked at some of the strategies. We looked at how to respond to inappropriate use or misuse of AI, looked at all the resources, and then I developed a set of student declaration statements, there's a template in there for each of the ECOS levels or AI levels of assistance that we have. And I've got a link to that as well. And of course, this toolkit was peer reviewed by a lot of people in the faculty. So there's acknowledgements of a lot of people who peer reviewed this toolkit in the end. So, for example, we went down to the level of what was invigilated, what was an individual task, what was a group task, what was the type of task as well. So we really wanted to see what the baseline was of the type of assessments we had across the board. I did tap into some of the other resources. Cradle had fantastic resources. There was some guidance from Charles Sturt University, and obviously some other guidance and resources that I added to the toolkit. Again, it's a living document. And the other thing we were looking at, how do we communicate Gen AI use or when not to use it, and what that communication might look like to students. We did look at some of the practices that were more susceptible to AI, obviously the written reports, the artefacts at the end, the short answer questions, the presentation slides, the multiple choice questions, and then some of the less susceptible to AI or inappropriate use. And of course, that's what we're aiming for. And then we also had resources going back to good principles and what those principles were. So we also wanted to look at, in this toolkit, where educators could harness Gen AI in an ethical way and developing some of those skills, and also how they could let their students know what other resources they had for students in that capacity, so build AI literacy. And then we came to looking at some strategies as well. And some of the strategies to consider. So, and this has developed over time. So when I first started with this toolkit, there was only a few strategies, but after having all these conversations and what's working and not working in other faculties and schools, I had the opportunity to present some of these strategies at the CAFIA conference last year at the University of Queensland, which is the Council of Academic Public Health Institutions Australasia. And it was a teaching and learning forum. So I just wanted to showcase kind of two cases and some of the things you might consider. So if you have a large cohort, online course, and it's online multiple choice questions, you're asking the students to take that online test home. Obviously start with the conversations, AI use, AI and academic integrity, some of the consequences if we ask them not to use it, for example. Now we do acknowledge that there is a place for multiple choice questions. I mean, for formative feedback, fantastic. But if you are using it for summative feedback, there is a place prior to consensus as well. And also to build that foundational knowledge, and also to think about some of the application of that foundational knowledge. So we consider that making that low stakes, that capping at 10% of the overall grade wasn't such a bad thing to consider. And of course, you'd apply the normal time limitations. I think we have like somewhere between 15 and 20 questions in an hour, and reordering the questions and answers as you would normally do. But also making sure that the questions aren't just a knowledge-based question, maybe, the nuances in the question, that making sure that they are applied questions. So being a bit more creative around the questions as well. And so usually we give them one attempt at a multiple choice assessment, but why not give them a couple of attempts? If we're only going to make it low stakes, give them a couple of attempts to this and not give them the answer. If they're incorrect, don't give them the answer. Maybe then that's when we direct them to other resources. So look at this Q1 journal, look at this chapter, go back to that podcast, go back to that video, go back to the class discussions we had on this date, go back to the readings that we had as part of the class discussions. So that will be part of their learning. The other highly vulnerable assessment type is the written report that they do at home and they hand it in. Saying the conversation still exists, but also the instructions as well. So, if we are looking at instructions with AI use or non-use or how are we instructing our students, and where are we doing that? Are we doing it on the Moodle site? Are we doing that in the assessment brief? Are we having that in the course outlines? And, each faculty actually is doing something a little bit different when it comes to where they instruct their students. So this will be continuously updated in the toolkit. If we're asking them to retain artefacts so we can see, or some of the drafts of their work, how are we doing that? How are we instructing our students to do that? And what is the process around that? So some governance around those retaining artefacts, for example, to see their thought processes. And are we weighting the processes higher than the product? So consider in the rubric design, some of the processes should be weighted higher, or even in the stage where I also teach some, a topic where it's related to a lit review. And I want to make sure that they're not, I actually asked them to use Gen AI. I wanted to be open about it. I wanted them to tell me how they're using Gen AI. But I also wanted them to note that in the rubric, I highly weighted the citations. If one of those citations was a hallucination or didn't actually correspond to the statement they had made, they would get 0 in that rubric. So weighting the process is higher than the product. I also asked them to, for the data extraction table, for example, I asked them to tell me, provide some of the studies that you're using, excuse me, but what are the reasoning behind choosing those studies over others? So that is a bit more of a nuanced type of question. Now, applying a reflective account for the processes, as you know, Gen AI is very good with reflections as well. But of course, these are some of the strategies to consider. You might want them to reflect on the discussions that you had in a classroom. You might want them to reflect on something, a visual stimulus. So that might be a little bit harder and a bit more resilient for AI. And obviously show that interpretation and clinical reasoning. So perhaps ask them to retain, I mean, there's lots of names for this, but a learning process log or a portfolio or something, so they can show their thinking along the way. And of course, consider conversation with students. Can they defend their work verbally if needed? Viva voce, for example. And I have that in the instructions that you may be called upon to defend your work. I haven't yet had anyone at this stage, but I have those in the set of instructions. Now, whether to retain artefacts or drafts, this is obviously going to be updated in our toolkit, and it will be great to get some thoughts in the room and online about this, because obviously this relates to a lot of workload for the educator as well. So we really need to think about some of the processes around that and streamlining those processes. Now, I wanted to showcase at UNSW. I know there's people online who are from other institutions, and welcome, by the way. So we have levels of assistance. There is a YouTube link here. Professor Alex Steele, who's the head of AI strategy, and he developed these AI levels of assistance with his team. And I've added this to the toolkit just as a resource, but I also wanted to add a set of student declaration statements that any of our course conveners can just tap into. So the statements might be at different levels. So you might declare that I've not used Gen AI in any way or completing this assessment, or acknowledge the use of whatever the tool is for grammar or simple editing. And there's a series of statements here. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but you're welcome to have a look. Now, it's interesting, and also there's statements with the full attribution as well. So there is a number of things that they can tap into. And just going back to the colleagues from Deakin and Sydney University, so they were talking about, the discursive changes that will not secure the assessment. And so the student may ignore or be a bit confused about how to acknowledge or disclose or ignore it altogether. And that is true, it doesn't secure the assessment. However, it is good practice to acknowledge your use with AI, and that's one of our principles here, and to acknowledge and model that. And even so, it is a good practice for our students to acknowledge when they use something and how they've used it. I see Gen AI as my collegial friend, and I guess people on the OpenAI ChatGPT trial probably do see it as this as well. I see it as AI as a partner for me and for critical thinking and engaging with AI, and that's how I would like to model it. But of course, there are many other people that may think otherwise for that. And again, just going back to Gen AI, you're only as good as the prompts that you put in and what you get out. And if you engage and be a bit more specific with those prompts, you can really get some great information. And of course, our own due diligence and checking the information that is generated. So in terms of future directions for this particular toolkit, it's a very fluid toolkit. It's a living document. In fact, only recently we added guidelines to suspected Gen AI misuse. This is applicable to Faculty of Medicine and Health, and these guidelines were led by my colleague Anita Hayward. So we are continuously updating those guidelines. The great thing about these guidelines, there are some templates in those guidelines, how to speak to the students, some templates on emails, correspondence, and some of the things to look for if we suspect misuse. We are learning from current and emerging case studies, and that is continuous. And also the growing capabilities of Gen AI, which always seems to surprise me. In fact, I'm learning a lot from the younger generation on Instagram and taking note of some of the things that they use Gen AI for. Okay, so the way forward, and these are just some considerations, and love to hear your thoughts online as well and in the room. So obviously go back to good course and assessment design principles, making sure that we do adhere to that. Encourage a community where students take agency and partnership in that quality, rigour, integrity of assessments. And when they do use AI, making sure that they do acknowledge. And I guess that goes back to professionalism. What type of professional do they want to be? And if they are using something, you should be acknowledging it in some capacity. Obviously, consider some of the other assessment assurance strategies or security, having synchronous and supervised assessment. It's not always possible with very large cohorts, but obviously it's somewhere we should consider, certainly across a program, and there should be stages across a program where there are secure assessments. Consider the process-orientated type of assessments, annotated bibliographies, reflective process logs, scaffolding drafts, for example. Also consider your rubric design. So if you look at the criterion, which is usually on the left-hand side of the rubric design, across your performance standards at the top, HD to fail, and your descriptors in the middle, think about in the descriptors where the higher order thinking processes. Are you including Bloom's taxonomy, cognitive verbs or thinks? And also thinking about where you're weighting some of the processes. If it's analysing or evaluating or critiquing, are they weighted higher than some of the other criterion in the rubric? And of course, with highly vulnerable tasks, take home multiple choice questions. Make it low stakes if you can, and perhaps give them multiple attempts without direct answers. And also really thinking about the assessment questions. So I just had a task where I was also mapping all the assessments across the school, and there were. And I just did a pilot on 49 postgraduate courses and looked at the assessment questions as well, and the assessment assurance, and aligned it to assessment vulnerability. And I was asking the course convenors, which is not my, I'm not teaching those courses, so I'm not the expert in those in that content. But some of the questions they would have in their short answer or their multiple choice questions, and it's really important that there was more application style questions across the boards. So maybe using current resources, current things, things that are topical in the news, visual stimulus, drawing from the classroom discussions and readings, and making that some of the things that you might want to include in your questions. And of course, other forms of assessments. Debates are great. So debates, you can have 3 on 3 on each side. You can have some observers. You got some engagement in the room. They can all have roles, and it really can be done in real time. Maybe you have an academic panel discussion. Again, if we've got some areas where we're supervising or overviewing, or having some aspects where there is some engagement like this, that also looks at collaboration, looks at the verbal and written responses, this might be another thing to consider. The viva voces or face-to-face, obviously, if possible, because even online interviews can be, you can use AI for real-time responses, and also, some of the Q&A in real time. Show and share your processes. So is there a body of work over time? How did you derive to that end product? What are the drafts? Are you keeping a portfolio? How are you demonstrating that work over time? And one of my things that I actually suggest to the students, that because I want to know how they use Gen AI, I want to know that. So I ask them to screenshot their prompts in their thinking, and have a look at some of those screenshots. Model Gen AI acknowledgement and use as a partner when in use. And the other thing I wanted to just touch base, because this only was updated yesterday, so TEXA is now shifting from an educative-led approach to a regulatory-led approach. As you may have seen this on LinkedIn yesterday afternoon, so I scrambled to put this back into the slides. But what does that mean? It means they are expecting education providers to be able to demonstrate how they're managing these risks to assessment integrity and the associated risks to compliance with the threshold standards. So watch this space, because a regulatory-led approach will be in place by the start of 2026. So things may change again. At the moment, it's an educative-led approach, and we're all undertaking that, but things may change early next year. We don't know all the answers, all the solutions, but obviously we should collectively talk about this and work and learn from each other. I'm always learning something new each day. There are a lot of resources and more current resources now. So I have included the resources that I've used within the slide deck here, and some of the more traditional resources as well. And also obviously acknowledge the resources from the paper that I've mentioned in here as well. Obviously generated this image with DALL-E, and I value any feedback you have and any questions in the room. We've got plenty of time for questions, and thank you, Laura, for the opportunity, and everyone in the room, thank you very much. Thank you. So Laura, would you, just because my eyesight's not great, and I know there's lots of things that have come up, as I can see that was coming up.
Yeah.
So
we've had a very vocal discussion.
I do hope to answer some of these questions, but like I said, I'm not the expert here. We are all learning from each other, and I guess these sorts of discussions are great because we can pick up information from other institutions, and we should be sharing those insights. So Laura, go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, we've had a very vocal discussion here. So one from Sarah earlier on in your presentation said, can you give an example of how to assign higher weight on the process in such assessments? I think that was regarding your example 2 you showed earlier.
Yeah, so I always, making sure that I go back to the rubric. So if I actually put in one of the criterion, processes of thinking, or how some of those areas would be critical thinking. If I can see some critical thinking, and if they've kept some sort of log or some sort of process of how they got to their artifact. So for example, where I asked them, why did you choose those articles to go into your lit review? I wanted to know that the way they were thinking about those articles, not the article has this and that, or that compares with that article. I wanted to know that. So I rated that much higher in the criterion on the left-hand side of the rubric. It was highly rated.
Thank you. So, Sarah, did you have anything else to ask her?
No, I don't have any question at this stage, but I think it's a little bit tricky at this stage, to consider this. I've had one assessment task last term 1, and yes, I have explained, all of them, in the lectures. And if, for example, for the critical part of the literature review, a student tells me, because this is, for example, more relevant, reference, and it is, a recent reference, that's why I have used, for example, them for the literature review, and it is correct, right? So then how we can go further from this? So how we can still I have this question, how we can find the process of thinking in their, in their written report, or in their
so how did they get to? I mean, obviously, that as educators, we're reading this. How did they get to that stage? So if something is a recent resource, it's not necessarily the best resource. I mean, likely it is, but there might be something in that resource that doesn't work. And how are they critiquing that resource?
Yeah, I understand you are talking about critical thinking. The critical thinking should get, higher weight compared to, other aspects of the, rubric. But still, I think we also have to think about what is needed in industry nowadays, whether industry, also wants students, our graduates to be, equipped with, some of the AI tools that can be used for, writing, proofreading, revisions, which I think we have to think about this as well, that if we want, to have authentic kind of assessment, we also need to look at industry, what's expected from industry nowadays in terms of, using AI, empowering students to be able to use AI tools, but in the right way. I think it is challenge. Yeah. And yeah, I'm thinking that we need, to
So they're really great questions. And obviously, I mean, I'm a pharmacist, so the professional bodies, we do need to have that connection with the accrediting professional bodies and the tools they're using. However, the tools do change and evolve, and by the time our students are out there, what I think would be more beneficial for us is how do we use or engage those tools depending on what the tool is, the consent around the tools. And I'll give an example, and this is probably an example more towards medicine. So a number of my colleagues, I'm a former hospital pharmacist and community pharmacist, but a number of my colleagues, they're all consultants now, and they use Heidi or Lyrebird for consultations. Now, those tools are getting better and better. Some of them prefer one or the other. By the time our med students or pharmacy students or whoever it is that leaves the university, it's not about that particular tool. It's about how we engaged in that tool. How are they presenting that with consent? How are they reviewing the tool? They're the things that we need to teach our students, not the tool itself. But I do see your point in we do need to connect with our professional bodies, accrediting bodies. We do need to do that. However, I don't know if there's been much engagement back and forth with the education bodies and the accrediting bodies because from a pharmacist perspective and others, I mean, I think they're relying on the education bodies to feed back to those professional bodies. So we're at a standstill here. But it is absolutely a good point. But where do we start with that? So absolutely a good point. Laura, is there anything else?
We have a few questions from Megan here, but I think this last question is a good one to maybe end on unless there's any other questions we have. Megan said, do we need to do more to actively teach students and ourselves how to use AI as a better tool with ongoing updates? Megan,
Absolutely.
did you want to?
Absolutely. AI literacy is a given. We need to do that. So I asked my class, we assume that they're all dabbling in it and maybe they're underreporting it. And I gave them an assessment task. I wanted them to use it. So there was no point in them saying, I didn't use it or not going to use it. But only 50% were engaged in it on a regular basis. So we're assuming that all of them are engaged in this. We need to bring them all up to standard. It needs to be equitable. We need to think about the resources around that. We need to teach them the literacy around it. We're learning the literacy. They're going to be our peers in that literacy. In fact, I'm learning from the younger generation to build on what I'm doing now. So absolutely, I think it has to be embedded. We do have a few resources. We have some basic modules for students. We have some we do have some of those resources, but I agree, they need to know how to use a few different tools and to showcase some of the things, the flaws or the nuances or the hallucinations or what they need to be watching out for. In any case, we want them to critique the outputs. We want them to have the due diligence. We want them to make sure whatever resource there is, they're going back to the DOI or the original article, because if they're going to be out there doing government briefs and presenting to professional bodies or whatever that might be, they have to be reputable. And so, it is a tool, and like any tool, if I sat around a table with my colleagues and talked about something, they might come up with some great ideas, but it's kind of hearsay. I have to go back to the sources to make sure that what they're saying is correct. So yes, I would be doing that as well. Absolutely, it should be embedded. That is the next level. We should be building this together. Laura, anything else? Or anyone else online? Anyone else open up?
Casey has a question here. Casey, did you want to ask this question directly, or did you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can ask. The thing, I work in the Faculty of Law, and so one of the skills that we're really trying to develop in our students is their written communication skills. And the thing that I'm constantly kind of grappling with, and I don't have an answer for this, is once upon a time, developing students' written communication skills was one of the things that we were trying to achieve. Now, what I'm wondering is it kind of futile to think of that as one of the outcomes of their learning, should we be trying to ensure students can write effectively without AI, or should we be realistic and embracing the idea that AI is here to stay, and that students, the more important thing is actually them learning how to write effectively with AI and use those critical thinking.
I can see Alex Steele from the law faculty has got his hand up. I'll let you answer that one, Alex.
No, it's such a good question from Casey, because one of the really interesting things is there's a Gartner Predict thing that came out a few months ago, which said that their predictions about what's happening with AI are, in the next 2 years, companies will be using AI to increase productivity and to lower the amount of new staff they're taking on. And they'll be using all of their junior employees to do things with AI and relying on the senior partners to check that it's right. And then they say by 2030, there'll be a crisis across all industries because nobody will have been trained to do any reading to be able to interpret the AI, and those partners will have retired. So they actually see, and we've been seeing this, sort of legal professions have been talking about this as an issue, but it's interesting that Gartner is seeing it as a worldwide issue, that there is this rush by industry at the moment to use AI, which will create a crisis because no one will be able to read and write. So I think Casey's completely right that we've actually got to really keep focusing on getting students to do the hard work. And in lots of ways, it's exactly those sort of classroom conversations where you get them to do things with AI and then you point out why the AI answer isn't good enough. Exactly. And it's that, I think for good students already know that. Our big problem is really with the struggling students who think this is a way to sort of get over this sort of issue that they've got, but in fact it's actually it's holding them back long term.
Great question, Casey. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks.
I know this, obviously the room's going to be taken up in a couple of minutes. So Laura, thank you very much, everyone. I might leave it there. There's the evaluation. I'd really appreciate your feedback. This is a collective conversation, so I really appreciate if we can continue this conversation and learn from each other. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. Thank you.